Well, Ukraine stunned Russia earlier this month when it did reclaim a small patch of land in the Kursk region of Russia. Since then, Russia's failed to repel this biggest incursion into its country since World War II, leaving many foreign policy experts scratching their heads. Russia has responded by launching a barrage of airstrikes employing hundreds of drones and missiles. It's a clear message about Russia's military might. Still, Ukraine appears to have achieved something in breaking into Russian territory. Now, Americans so far have not allowed Ukraine to employ long-range weapons made in the U.S. for fear that that could spark World War III between Russia and the U.S. To break down what is going on and explain where Russia, Ukraine, and the U.S. stand in this war is retired Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, a foreign policy and military expert. Thanks for coming back to Rising.
Always good to have you here. Thanks for having me.
So this was a success, I think, by Ukraine to the military to break into Russian territory. But does it actually change the long-term trajectory of the war? Does it put Ukraine in a position of actually having to defend more territory?
Well, I actually argue quite the contrary. I don't think this is a success on the Ukraine side at all. As a matter of fact, I think that time may prove that this hastened their potential military loss. And let me explain why. When you're talking about sending between 15 and 20,000 total soldiers into a country the size of Russia, there's literally no chance that that can have any kind of success because Russia just has too many resources, personnel, ammunition, air power, etc. And that is basically a dead man walking. It's not going to be too much longer before Russia's going to put this out. Now, here's the other part that not many Western commentators seem to be even aware of. But there is a lot of evidence, and I have had this corroborated from some folks who've been on my show on Daniel Davis Deep Dive, that a full month before this happened, apparently some Russian observers recognized what was happening, and they actually allowed and facilitated made it easier for the Ukraine side to go into this incursion, which they contained. Here's why. Because Ukraine sent some of their best trained soldiers and most of their available strategic weapon systems and reserves into this area, and they are being methodically destroyed. Meanwhile, Russia did not move any of its troops from the east, especially in the Pokrovsk area, and a little bit further south even in that. And they are making significant and now accelerated moves in the east, and they could potentially even break through for the first time really in the war, the Ukraine side. So they are in a much more perilous situation than many people realize.
I'm going to ask you a question I've asked on the show before, but I want your perspective on this. With this invasion into Russia, it seems to play into Russia's hand with the narrative that they have, which is that there is a far right force within Ukraine, that there's, Nazis in Ukraine coming to power, and that's what motivated their invasion. And this kind of aggressive action fighting back at Russia, is this something that strengthens that narrative and makes it hard for Ukraine to say, we're the victim of an invasion here, please help protect us against this invasion, making their case to the West? It seems to me that taking this action could potentially motivate, the Russian troops, more of them to fight, for them to fight harder to protect their country, and really see the narrative that the Russian government has in this war being true.
Well, it's even more than you think there, because first of all, on the points that you raised, it didn't help that there were German Marder infantry carriers, what some called tanks, an infantry fighting. It's an armored vehicle from Russia, from Germany, invading into the Kursk region in Russia, where there's a big famous battle between the Germans, the Nazis, and the Russians back in the World War II, and that certainly reaffirmed those fears. The bigger issue that this reinforces on the Russian side is that this is the West and NATO and all of the European Union against Russia. And they say, look, you have British Challenger tanks, you have German Martyrs, you have American Stryker vehicles. This is all of the West literally invading into our country. And so it is absolutely solidified any kind of support for Russia, for Vladimir Putin in particular, and giving him basically a free hand to do whatever he wants to do. And at first, a lot of the Russian people were upset that Putin didn't move really quickly to get rid of all this incursion. But now then many of the commentators are saying, actually just keep those flanks open and keep it contained. But as long as Ukraine keeps throwing reserves inside there, they're going to be methodically destroyed, and they're not going to be available elsewhere. So this is actually being viewed in Russia now as a positive thing, and it reinforces, to your point, all of those things about the Nazi issues and whatever, but especially that it's the West against Russia.
Well, and you could maybe make the case for, I could see the argument for, they seize this territory, give them, a leg up in immediate short-term negotiations. Maybe that strengthens their position right now, but they're not going to be able to hold this going forward. As you say, this is diverting resources they need to protect the rest of Ukraine to this effort. So if they, if they had on the the backs of a military success, you leverage that success for negotiation to maybe get a stronger outcome right now. But knowing you have to do that now rather than wait when you won't be able to hold that position, is there any indication that this was some kind of stunt or achievement so that they could get a more favorable deal in negotiations? Is there any indication they even want to negotiate? They being the Zelensky government.
In fact, both Zelensky and some of his senior officials have expressly said this was part of the reason, that they wanted to improve their negotiating position from a position of strength, et cetera. But it's frankly just mind-boggling and puzzling to me why anyone thinks that Russia would actually capitulate and negotiate from a position of weakness. And in fact, we see the exact opposite has happened. You've had from Maria Zakharova all the way on down, Sergei Lavrov, the deputy, Ryabkov, have absolutely said there will be no negotiations now. They had an offer on the table in June. They said that is now absolutely off the table. We will now win on the battlefield what we want. Now, it remains to be seen whether they can make good on that. Evidence suggests that that's maybe a real possibility. We'll see how that plays out. But it absolutely has killed any possibility and thought on the Russian side of having a negotiated settlement. And then you have really a strange press conference yesterday in Kiev where Zelensky said, I'm going to bring in September a victory plan to President Biden. And given the conditions on the battlefield, it's like, are you even still going to be in the fight by then? Because things are going definitely in the wrong direction, and they're accelerating the losses in the East. And now you have Zelensky talking about a victory plan, and frankly, I see no basis for it.
Let's get into the long-range weapons. This is something that seemingly Zelensky very much wants, that the United States has said absolutely not. This will involve the West in a wider war, which makes sense in the context of what you just said about how Russia sees this now as a war against the West. I think it's the right move not to give them, access to long-range weapons or employ them against Russia. What do you make of this? Do you see the U.S. ever wavering on that?
Well, you certainly would expect and understand if Zelensky ignores the certain answer of no, because we've given that throughout 2.5 years of war, and then we have gone back on literally everything so far, all the way up to and including the F-16s here recently. None of it has made any difference on the battlefield. Neither would this. All it's going to do is continue to escalate the situation and to increase the possibility that this does expand. You had Sergei Lavrov again emphatically state yesterday, in light specifically of with permission to try and strike deeper into Russia with U.S. or Western-made weapons. He said, you're playing with fire if you think that there will never be a consequence. And I think it's foolish to say, oh, they're just bluffing and they just ignore it and go on, because I'm not sure that they are bluffing on this one, especially when you're talking about their actual territory longer range. And you see that they have been building up a sizable strategic reserve that could be employed offensively here in the coming months or so. But the bigger issue is it will not make any difference, even if Biden eventually succumbs to this as well. And you don't need any more proof of that than look at the Ukraine side here. That you see that Russia has virtually an open door to attack with long-range missiles throughout the entire country, which they've just done on consecutive nights here to devastating consequence. But it hasn't stopped the Ukraine side from actually continuing on for their war. The idea that the Russian side, much, much bigger, much more capable air defense systems would be crippled by this, which I've heard even earlier today, many Western commentators say, yeah, that's what would happen. It's nonsense. And it's like people who don't know what they're talking about. And I'm just being blunt here. They are dead wrong if they think that's what would happen. You would have a risk of escalation. You would not have a successful tactical situation.
Lieutenant Colonel Daniel Davis, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Always my pleasure. Thank you.